EPO, steroids, doping. All words that are inextricably tied to the short history of professional male cycling due to their consistent use by athletes in the racing circuit. Today, consumption of illicit substances continue to decrease the legitimacy and viewership of the sport, making it a primary mission of the Union Cyclists Internationale, or the UCI, to eliminate the problem. Before solving the problem, however, the UCI must figure out why it exists. In an attempt to make their job a little easier, in this slidecast I try to answer the question, why is doping culture a part of professional male cycling? Simply put, doping chemically alters the physiology of the user. It can be used by cyclists to increase stamina or strength, to recover from injury, or to mask the presence of another drug. In other words, doping makes the body more effective at what the athlete is training it to do, or to prevent the detection of drugs which help with training. Perhaps the most obvious reason athletes use drugs is for personal gain, whether that be achievement in the sport or monetary reward. Most professional cyclists work their entire lives to achieve athletic glory, and often, a major barrier separating them from their relative athletic potential is a lack of doping. In the case that an athlete does dope, some say that he or she has made an economic decision. The reward of having a shot at professional cycling glory, such as a Tour de France win, or as I will describe later, the prize of actually completing the competition, outweighs the price of being caught and the adverse health effects of using the banned substances. In a more complex analysis of this decision, researchers at the University Catholique de Louvain use game theory to uncover the factors that determine whether or not a cyclist will dope. It was found that a decrease in the effectiveness of doping tests, an increase in the number of cycling events, an increase in the spread of prizes at the events, and a decrease in perceived health costs greatly increased the average professional cyclist's desire to dope. Now you might be inclined to say, Eric, these economic analyses are a gross oversimplification of the issue at hand. To which I would reply, yeah, economic analyses usually are. But you're right, many other external factors also perpetuate the doping culture in cycling. Since the 1950s, most professional cyclists have used drugs simply to survive the rigors of the sport, as the demands of the circuit are usually too great for even a very fit, well-trained human body. For many, doping wasn't seen as a way to perform at 120% capability. Rather, it was used to bring the body from 40% back to 90%. Professional cyclist Rick van Steenbergen paints a vivid picture of the lives of professional cyclists in 1967 Eastern Europe, the global center of road racing at the time. Sometimes I had to ride my bike in Paris and then immediately after the race get into my car and drive for 10 hours to Stuttgart, where I was back on my bike again. The top riders were obligated to be fresh each time, and they could not do that without stimulants. Nobody could ever or will ever be able to do that because there is no such thing as supermen. Doping is necessary in cycling. Between 1967 and today, training methods, race scheduling, and transportation have improved greatly, but pro cycling isn't much easier. With the introduction of international points ranking system and designated championship races, in the 1980s, both teams and individuals became more competitive as one's performance in the circuit directly affected the team's ability to compete in the biggest races, like the Tour de France and the Giro d'Italia. Because of this, the speed of the races increased by an average of 5%, making stage races increasingly difficult. Some medical professionals claim that the major races like the Tour de France are now so difficult that the average professional cyclist would not be able to complete it, let alone compete for the win, without the aid of performance-enhancing drugs. This idea is related in Paul Kimmage's memoir, Rough Ride, in which he states that the doping was necessary for each stage of the Tour de France so he could simply climb atop his bike the next day. Through the years, as expectations of rider has increased, so has the difficulty of races, and consequently, the necessity to dope. In the book, Kimmage also explains that his primary worry during the 1998 Tour de France was the renewal of his contract with the relatively small team RMO. Post-Tour de France, over 50% of racers are considered possible redundancy, making the desire to finish the race and finish well even greater. This pressure associated with contracts is a product of the corporate dominance in the sport. Cycling is unique in that it is not organized as a profit-making endeavor itself. However, logic of the sponsoring corporation is still brought to bear insofar as it serves as a promotional branch of the firm. Professional cycling is commercial cycling. Allow me to explain. All cycling teams bear the name of the corporation or business entity that sponsors the team and pays for team expenses. Since all spectators of races, like the Tour de France or Giro d'Italia, can hardly be charged a ticket price, and the sport is not popular enough for team-specific licensed goods to be sold exclusively, cycling team sponsors require the use of brand exposure through the athletes to obtain revenue. Money used to support a team is usually drawn from a corporation's marketing, advertising, and public relations budgets, and is viewed as an alternative to other possible revenue from media exposure. Sponsors assume correctly for the most part that their team's success in races will generate more free press coverage than could have been realized with the same amount of directly purchased advertising. If the cycling team is not successful enough to garner sufficient media attention to offset the cost of funding the team, the sponsor could revoke their funding and the team would dissolve. This happened during the recession in the 1990s when many riders were left without teams and funding. The mechanism by which market pressure is transmitted and applied to a commercial team is a form of instrumental rationalism. In other words, a cycling team is simply used as a means to an end, that is, increased corporate revenue. Hence, riders are faced with even greater pressure to perform well, as success means continued funding from their sponsor. Oftentimes, inter-team peer pressure could be used to force riders to dope, as performance-wise it is better for the team as a whole to have recovered and fit riders. As well, in some cases, to secure their team's success, sponsors have hired high-profile doctors to administer performance-enhancing drugs to their athletes. Dr. Francesco Conconi was used extensively by multiple teams and individual racers to chemically enhance performance, and was believed to have helped develop EPO. Furthermore, the two doctors hired by Team Telecom, along with many other hired medical specialists, have admitted to providing drugs to athletes. What is particularly unfair about the whole situation is that, regardless of whether or not their team gets caught for using drugs, the sponsor usually emerges unscathed. If a rider from Corporation A's team is caught doping, Corporation A sheds the blame simply by taking the moral high ground and withdrawing support. Even after the Lance Armstrong scandal, perhaps the biggest cycling scandal in sporting history, it can be seen that the sponsor of his old team, Discovery Channel, only saw an overall increase in stock value during his trial in February of 2013, indicating that the public opinion of the corporation was affected very little by the doping allegations. As it's counterproductive to deter athletes from achieving personal excellence in cycling, attempting to decrease the difficulty of cycling races and putting greater restraint on corporate sponsors to alleviate the pressure they place on respective teams seem like the best ways for the UCI to crack down on doping. However, since the sport relies heavily on tradition of multi-stage events and its corporate structure produce revenue, these may be difficult to install in professional cycling without causing worse injury to the sport. As is usually the case in topics of contention, like the general use of doping in sport, there is no easy solution. Nevertheless, many experts agree that doping culture is an unsustainable feature of professional cycling. In other words, something has to give, the sport or the doping.